La Asociación de Harvard Alumni for Education, lo que tratamos de hacer es conectar a personas que han estudiado en Harvard o amigos de Harvard que estén trabajando en educación, principalmente en la región de Latinoamérica. Si no conoces de JAE, te invito a que te puedas unir con nosotros. Ahí está el link dentro de la página para que lo puedan buscar y se puedan unir para recibir noticias de lo que está pasando en Latinoamérica en cuestión de educación principalmente. En el caso de este capítulo que es JAED, pero de Latinoamérica, hay un JAED que es global y en este caso es JAED de Latinoamérica. Eh, Creo que hay personas que hablan solamente inglés. Si es así, solamente me gustaría solamente saber cuántos solamente hablan inglés y no hablan español. If you just speak English and do not speak Spanish, just raise your hand just to check if everybody speaks Spanish, or we can do the presentation in English, but just to be sure. I think, Bodan, you speak just English or Spanish?
Just English, I'm sorry.
Okay, we're gonna do it in English then. I think that everybody here also speak English. Welcome. And first, we are going to start here just introducing ourselves. My name is Eric Ramirez. I'm co-leading what is HIAD in Latin America. It's Harvard Alumni for Education. We organize different events every month, and we have like also different blogs or different information that is in our website. And we try to connect people that is working in education, people that have studied in Harvard, or people that is friend of Harvard. Also, we have Gustavo Rojas, who is here too. He's going to help me with this session. Hello, Gustavo. Nice to see you here. And also Patty Vasquez del Mercado, who also will be joining us in a few minutes. She's stepping out from another meeting. We have different people that also is supporting us. Is Peter Swink, Ivana Zacarias, Maria Salmeron, Ingrid Orea, and they're representing all Latin America. They are based in Costa Rica, in Honduras, in Argentina, in different countries in Latin America too, in Chile, in different parts. But welcome to be here. I'm very excited to be here with Emiliana Vegas. I'm going to present her about her trajectory. I have this bio in Spanish, but we'll try to translate it into English as soon as I'm presenting her. Um, Emiliana right now is a professor of practice in the Harvard School of Education. She has been working in education and different initiatives of development during several years. She has a doctor's by the Harvard University, the School of Education, and a master in public policy by Duke University. She has a bachelor's degree in communications by the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello from Caracas, Venezuela. Before joining her full-time in Harvard in 2022, she was the co-director of the Center for Universal Education in Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Before that is where I met her. She used to work at the Inter-American Bank. She worked there for 7 years. She was the chief of division of the education section, the Inter-American Bank. Basically leading different strategies to provide loans and provide assistance to different countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. She worked also for 10 years in the World Bank doing research, education operations for low-income countries. Her research is about education, is about innovation, development, and to help improve the education and to improve the quality of education and equity in education. She's from Caracas. She lives between Washington, D.C., Boston, Naples, Florida, and different parts. She has a big family with 2 kids and 3 stepsons with their own families also, which is a huge family. Welcome, Emiliana, to be here with us.
Thank you, Eric and Gustavo and Patty, for having me. It's a pleasure to meet this new, for me at least, Association of Harvard Alumni, and I got the link to join as well. So, pleasure to be with you today.
Okay. To start the conversation, Emiliana, I would love if you can help us to define what is international development first.
Yeah, well, international development, in my view, is sort of the efforts of organizations that are considered wealthy countries that have high GDPs, etc., to transfer some of these resources and technical capacity to help reduce poverty and improve economic development in low and middle income countries.
And when did you first realize that you wanted to work international development? How your career started with this?
So I never knew about international development because actually Venezuela has changed so much over the course of my lifetime. When I grew up there in the 70s and 80s, it was one of the wealthier countries in Latin America, and the presence of institutions like the World Bank, IDB, the UN, United Nations agencies were not as visible. And it was really when I was doing my master's at Duke University that I started working at a think tank based in North Carolina called Research Triangle Institute. Many of you know it, RTI International. And it was there that I learned that, look, there were these institutions like the World Bank, the IDB, USAID, I'm sorry for what's going on right now, that fund programs and both from nonprofit and government organizations to improve lives in low and middle income countries. And I became fascinated by the opportunity that, the skills I was learning in my own graduate program of looking at data, trying to understand policy issues and make recommendations, how those could be relevant to international development in general.
Fantastic. Something interesting is that when we think of international development, and you just mentioned, we think that these are the same institutions. And in your book, you mentioned that no, these international organizations have like different roles, and you have identified like 5 different roles. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I tried to make it simple so that, my target audience is people who want to make a difference in the world, know something about these institutions, but really don't understand how they work and what you need and to get in and to have an impact from them. And I realized that a lot of my students, students at the Graduate School of Education, masters, doctoral students want to work and come to me as an advisor, like, how did you do this? But they don't really know. And there wasn't anything that explain what you actually do in these institutions and what they do. So I grouped them briefly into global funders. Those are the multilateral development banks in which I spent the bulk of my career. And they provide loans and grants and technical assistance. Then I talk about the private philanthropies that have grown in importance in our field. Obviously, the Gates Foundation is a major one, but I'm on the board of Jacobs Foundation, which in education is really, I think innovative and important. And there are many others. They fund, but their resources are not coming from governments. They're coming from the private sector. Third is what I call the conveners, and these are institutions whose main mandate, and I want to clarify that I'm kind of classifying them based on their main mandate, but in practice, many of them do other things. So the World Bank also convenes. It's not only a funder. But for example, the UN's primary function is to convene institutions to set agendas, to agree on ways to collaborate across countries, et cetera. And the Center for Universal Education at Brookings in general does advocacy and research, but also a lot of convenings. That's sort of my third category. Then I talk about advisors. Institutions like RTI International, but also private consulting firms, Bain and Company, McKinsey. They also do a lot of work both to advise governments as well as the international development agencies that I just was referring to. And then finally, I like to speak about the ones that I never have worked in, but I respect perhaps so much because they're the ones that are with boots on the ground, and I call them the implementers. Institutions in our field like Save the Children, UNICEF, and others read that are, in the countries. Some of them are global, some of them are regional, but they're really they get funded by many of the other actors, including governments, but they're supporting actually programs, school meals, teacher training program, distribution of materials, etc.
It's as you have mentioned, international development is a big area, very large area. But why did you choose at the beginning of your career to focus to be working in these organizations as the World Bank, Inter-American Bank? What happened and why was your inspiration to
It
follow
was,
this path?
like I'm sure we all mid-career and not so mid-career, more further along as I am. We have stories of what we thought we wanted to do, and then where we end up is not exactly, at least that's my story. I had no idea what I wanted to do, but I had the privilege really of having doing my high school in the United States and then going back to Venezuela for college. And at that point, I had to choose a field for my BA, and since I had no idea, and as many of us who live in Latin America or have studied in Latin America know, you have to make a decision very early in your career before you apply to university often, unlike in the US where you apply to a school and then you declare a major in your second year. There you have to apply to a program within a university, such as engineering in the Catholic or the Central University in my case. And I didn't see myself as an engineer or a lawyer or an economist. I had no idea. But I did know that I liked writing, I liked liberal arts, I liked history, and the closest sort of degree in Venezuela at the time that I could find that was more like a liberal arts degree was what they called social communications. And after 3 years of regular history, a little bit of economic statistics, you get exposure to, you get to declare whether you want to focus on journalism, audiovisual arts, or marketing. And so I chose journalism. I thought, well, that's a way to have impact on policy. And part of it had to do with the fact that after completing high school in the US in an academically excellent school, I found college easy. And it was a very competitive program, very hard to get into. You have to be one of the top students from schools across the country. And my classmates were really bright and they're very successful, I have to say. But I could see that I wasn't struggling to do well in school and they were. And I attributed that difference to the opportunity I had had to study in a school that really taught me to write well, to think well, to do math and and to study in a way that was practical. And so I became convinced early on, and I probably wouldn't have articulated it in this way, that there must be a correlation between the low quality of education in the country and the fact that we had so many people living in poverty and there was such high inequality. And so very early on, I decided, well, I want to do something with policy. I'm not really ready to be a journalist. I felt like I didn't have enough depth in the area. I had some very basic skills. I could write, but I didn't know what to write about. And so that's why I went to Duke University to get this, first graduate degree. And I started working at RTI and I really loved it. And fortunately, they hired me full time after graduation. And I realized again that I didn't have the level of skills I needed to do the work I wanted to do. So my boss and my favorite professors at Duke had all been economists working in education policy issues. And so I became really interested in economics of education and how that informs policy, or how that, analyzing education problems through the lens of economists can help you inform policymakers. And while I was able to apply statistics programs to, let's say, a research question that my boss would give me, and to draft some findings, I wasn't able, and I could see the difference, and perhaps because my boss was so brilliant, that how he came up with a research question and how we would methodologically explore the information, what data we needed, how we would, interpret the findings from doing statistical analysis. And so that's why I ended up choosing to then get a doctorate. And at the time also, to be honest, being a very, Latina from a traditional upbringing, wanting to have a family, after, ideally without a divorce in between, but whatever, like life doesn't end up how you plan it. But I did want to be a mother. I wanted to be married. I wanted to have a career, but I also wanted to a, have a family. And I didn't think the international development career was going to be compatible with having a family because it involved a lot of travel and long hours of work, et cetera. And so somehow I thought, well, if I love research and I love working in international development and I can get a position in academia, I can get kind of my cake and eat it too. That was my plan. That's why I came to Harvard as a graduate student. And yet, when I was in the job market, as they call it, and I applied to tenure track positions and I got a couple offers. I also applied to the World Bank's Young Professional Program, in part because during my time at Harvard, I met my then husband, or we got married, and he moved to Washington. So I was like, well, I'll apply to this program. I had done an internship there, I had done some of my dissertation research with the World Bank and the IDB. And so I kind of knew how they worked, and I knew I could do good research from the World Bank. So I applied and got in, and the two academic offers I ended up receiving were in the Midwest, in sort of a rural town, university town, and in upstate New York, also in a sort of small university town. And, I was thinking about, after having lived here in the Cambridge, Massachusetts area, and how great I felt having so many people who were from different countries and cultures. And I wasn't the only one. And visiting these schools, I realized I would be probably the only one in the department who wasn't, a white American. And I was by then, expecting my first child, and I didn't want to raise a family in a town that was not very diverse. And so that's why I ended up starting my career at the World Bank, hoping that I would start in the research department, publish a lot, and then apply to another university. And as it turns out, I did get my first rotation in research. And I had my baby at home and I go to work, and I was dreading leaving my child to go to, a windowless office, work by myself, kind of be a doctoral student all over again with very limited deadlines, no like collaboration, or very limited collaboration. And the minute I had to rotate, and ended up working in the education team of the Middle East and North Africa region, and was asked to do, a sector study for education in Morocco, I found that super exciting. Here I was applying again my research skills that I had just acquired, but they were, there was a deadline. We had to turn it because it was going to inform a loan, and we were traveling to Morocco and meeting with the authorities, and and so I realized that's where I really fit. And so I decided to, give it a shot and stay in what in these banks is called the operations department. But I always had this fear of, how do I keep doing research, both because I enjoy doing it and I don't want to lose those skills, but also because what if I, one day don't want to stay working in these institutions? I want to have options. So that's kind of how my career started.
That's fantastic. It's an amazing story. And right now, as a professor in the Harvard School of Education, how do you connect with international development?
Well, I have a very exciting project. So there's my first year was 2.5 years ago. I started in 2022, and I taught 3 courses. And then in January, I was in a coffee, which I tell the whole story in my book. I won't bore you with the details, but that gave me the idea of writing the book. And I spent most of 2023 writing the book proposal, then writing the manuscript, and it went to the editors at the end of 2023. And then most of 2024, which is just this last year, I devoted the spring term to revising and working with the editors to get the book out, and then to also revising the courses that I had taught for the first time the previous fall. And, as a novice teacher, because frankly, we are at the School of Education want to do the best job we can educating adults, and that's not something I've really done in my career. And fortunately, we have a teaching and learning lab, and we also have very good student evaluations that give us great feedback. And frankly, I've been learning a ton. But I spent a lot of time in the spring renewing my courses. And once the book came out last fall and even this spring, I've been doing a lot of book talks and traveling to present the book, especially now that I'm not teaching in the spring. I'll be doing a whole tour of the US and then Europe and Argentina, and et cetera. But the good news is I'm advising a number of PhD students who are first and second years, and hopefully a few more that are coming in the fall, who want to do their research in Latin America. They're from the region. And that's been a really, I think, difficult thing when you're at an institution like Harvard is how do you connect to real data, real policy issues that you can do high quality, rigorous research. And so while I was finishing the book, two of them came to me with the idea of why don't we do an education lab for Latin America? So I've gotten some seed funding from the ed school, and we call it ELA or ELA, Education Lab for Latin America at HGSE. And what we are doing is essentially a number of things, but primarily partnering with governments and organizations working in the region. So I'm offering to all of you, if you're interested in having high quality research, but also we're doing some capacity strengthening. I'm partnering with the Department of Education of São Paulo, Brazil, and we're bringing the secretary and his high level team now in April. And for that, we do like a study, a brief sector assessment on the key constraints to improving quality in São Paulo. And then hopefully we'll be doing some of that. We're doing an evaluation of the public education reform in Chile. We're doing hopefully some work in Colombia soon. And so little by little, the students come with ideas. People, because I've worked so long in Latin America and know basically so many people across the sector, they come to me like, how do we collaborate? I'm like, well, I'm happy to put my really brilliant students and guide them. And if you have an interesting evaluation we can do you need capacity strengthening, we can bring other professors. So we're just beginning literally this term with it, but I'm very excited that we already have a few projects and we have a few other professors who have interest in working in Latin America as well. So
This is fantastic. Thank you. I have a question, and this is for people that is starting their career. What advice will you give to them in going into international development? Or people that is not so young as myself and somebody else that is here, what will be your advice?
I would say there are, depending on the type of organization, and we talked about funders, primarily the development banks, the private philanthropies, and then we have implementers. But the kind of, I would say, two or three really basic skills. The more you can get them, the better chance you have of both, getting in and having impact. I think one of them has to do with, I want to say, kind of how do you sort through a ton of information, make sense of it, and make recommendations? So you can call it data analysis, or you can call it statistical analysis. It usually for most of the development banks involves a lot of numbers, and we get a lot of data about how many kids are in school, how are they performing. You want that kind of data to then assign some resources to, and so you need to have sort of those skills. Related to like doing the analysis is how do you communicate it? I think one of the strengths of the ed school has been historically, even when I went there, I remember my advisor telling me like, if you want to have impact in policy, it's not just that you have to do rigorous research. You have to communicate in a way that anybody can understand it. So don't just speak to other economists, for example, and the jargon that economists love to use. If you want to communicate with a policymaker, an education secretary who oftentimes comes from the education sector, doesn't share the same language, you want to, and that's a skill that we really try now that I'm on the other side, train our students. It's something that certainly I got a lot of training in. And I insisted a lot with my IDB colleagues, like, let's stop the jar. It's very different also how I think how we learn to write in Latin America and in European countries versus in American public policy schools. And I find that the public policy language is very useful when you want to be like straight to the point. You assume your target audience doesn't have a lot of time to read. And so you first tell them exactly the bottom line, then you support your arguments. And the Latin American way is like, it's a mystery novel. I'm going to start with the background. And then finally, at the very end, if you're still with me, you might get to my bottom line. And so that's something that I think is very helpful. Know how to communicate well, both in writing and orally, of course, because you have a lot of meetings. You need to persuade people from your supervisor to their supervisor to the client, the counterpart. So those are like two important skills. I would say a third one is project management. Even if you're doing research, you're managing resources, right? So when you do research in the banks, you get assigned a budget. You have to spend it within a determined time period. You can use it for your, certain staff time, but you can also hire some people, use it for traveling. You have to know how to plan and execute. And so I think that's relevant, of course, for the projects that your banks are known for, the big loans, but it's also very relevant for the studies. And I tell a story in the book where, very early on when I was in the research department in my first year as a YP, with my direct supervisor, Beth King, who was wonderful, we made a proposal to do a study on teacher incentives globally. And so we had identified 10 reforms that would affect teacher incentives from Central America, from Chile, also in Vietnam, Philippines. And we said, we want to do at the time, it wasn't an RCT, it was all, using quasi-experimental ex post evaluation methods. But we knew there was data and we wanted to explore it. And by the time we succeeded in the whole round of they have proposals, they evaluate, and then they announce that who wins the resources. She had moved on to the Human Development Department in the East Asian Pacific region, and I was about to go to the Latin America region after having had my stint in the Middle East and North Africa. And so she had a management position by then, and she said, you know what, most of the cases are from Latin America. Would you mind leading this study? And so I talked to my boss and they said, sure. So it became a regional study on teacher incentives in Latin America. And I have to say, I called on all, I was fresh out of doctorate. I had met all the leading people graduating from PhDs, Miguel Urquiola, who was in Columbia, Patrick McEwen, who was at Illinois Champaign. And I knew they liked working in Latin America. So I said, hey, we want to do a study of carrera magisterial in Mexico. Patrick, would you do it? And he goes, well, I'll do it if Lucrecia Santibáñez, who's at Stanford right now, can collaborate because she really has the data and like that. And it was small budgets for them, but enough that it was a nice thing for an assistant professor beginning their career to get some budget and access to data. And for me, it was getting great minds. So I planned it. We had a huge team of some were staff from the bank, some were researchers in the field, like Pilar Romaguera, Alejandra Misala from Chile, doing the work in Chile. And I just coordinated and did one of the papers on Bolivia with Miguel. And as it turns out, I think we did decent work. It's not earth-shattering. The main message was there's no magic bullet, which of course is not a great selling piece for policymakers. But it's all about the nuances. And then I get all these stars. For 2 years into the bank, I'm the World Bank's expert on teacher incentives. Any other research study I want to apply to, I get because I was able to execute my budget in the allocated time and deliver a quality product. And so I say, that's a basic skill that when you have that, I think in any industry, it's important. It's something that gets you. And then I think finally, I would say, at the World Bank, in the UN, in any of these large global organizations, including, I would say less so in the IDB because it's so Latin American that you walk in and you feel like you're in Latin America. But even in the IDB, we have differences across cultures. So being able to work with people who think differently, who come from different backgrounds and perspectives, and respect their cultures and their perspectives, I think that's an important skill that actually not only makes life easier because, teams work more efficiently, but also makes the products better because people come at it from different angles.
And let's gonna speak about the book. Why did you decide to write this book? Let's change the world.
So I was January of 2023, like I was mentioning, I had just come back in November from the Jacobs Foundation board meeting. I'm part of that board, and they also have this Jacobs Best Practice Awards. They had the ceremony out in Zurich, and I met and had a nice chat with one of the winners, Noam Angrist for Youth Impact. So I had met him before. We had been sort of communicating primarily social media, but we never really had a chance to talk. And they do amazing work based in Botswana, but throughout sub-Saharan Africa with teaching at the right level, but doing really evidence around it. And they've been promoting a lot of sort of rapid control trials that produce really actionable evidence. And so I respected their work a lot. And I learned that he often comes to Cambridge. That he and his partner have a house in Cambridge. And so we talked about, well, next time you come, let me know. And he wrote me saying, I'm going to be there in January. Are you free for coffee? So I said, sure. So we agreed to meet right in Harvard Square, mid-afternoon one day. And really, he came, obviously someone who's very successful also comes very prepared to a meeting. And he's fairly young. So he came with this whole detail, like, I have a list of questions. And all the questions were primarily, how does a World Bank work? Why is this so hard? And what about this person at the IDB or this person at the World Bank? And I was just very blunt and gave him, like, my insider's view after knowing all these people, knowing how these institutions work, knowing how you should maneuver if you want to partner with them, if you want to publish. His goal was he was doing a lot of research. And at the end of that coffee, he basically said, you should write a book. You would help people like me to better understand. And you're now at Harvard and you can say whatever you want. And that was very interesting because it's true that one of the downsides of working in large international organizations is that whatever you want to say has to be cleared by the External Relations Office, right? So I remember once I was furious about something that was happening in my home country and I tweeted something and I got a call immediately, like, take that down, it's a member of the. So you don't have that. You can't be a political activist. You're an international development officer. And so I found it refreshing. And literally I had, in the spring term, I don't teach, so I have more time. And I just started doing something, and which is not this book. It was more biographical, less informative. But it was really interesting to put down on paper all these anecdotes that I had and where I had learned. And then basically I got, thankfully, advice from my then 20-year-old son, who's a very good writer. I asked him, I said, I don't trust anybody, Emilio, to read this, but if you can, and give me feedback. And he spent like, the kid spent like 2 hours in my desk and I was cooking. And I was wondering why it was taking so long because I'd only written like 15 pages. And he comes out and he goes, Mom, you need a lot of help. And I was like, what? What do you say that? I said, Mom, do I think you have a book? I do. My friends say you should write a book, but this is not it. Like, you need to show, not tell. And I'm like, what's that? Because in academia, particularly as an economist, you're taught to, like, you write exactly what see, the data. This is what it tells me. And so you're not like going with, so his example, which I realized was very helpful, was, look, Mom, you're making dinner. You could say I'm making a soup, or you could say I'm holding the ladle and putting the broth. And I get the point that you're making a soup. That's showing, not telling. And so it was a whole different skill set. And I ended up reaching out to a really good friend from that high school in the US who has become a very good writer, an unpublished author after having had her first career in law. And I basically said, can we have a call and can you advise me? And she gave me great advice. And I started again, and then I got some even more help, and yeah, that's how I did it.
Fantastic. And let's change the word. The book is not a business book, but however, it offers a lot of career tips and how to maneuver. And you were mentioning this part of how to maneuver and how to work with international organizations. Can you share some examples and some different pathways and different strategies that we have to use when working with international organizations, or how to work with international organizations?
Yeah, I think, I have three parts in the book. So the first is really how you get in, and it's about the skills that you need, what we've been talking kind of right now. Then I have like how you thrive, and that's how do you manage, like how are you a team leader or a team player? Because we have all these roles. Sometimes you lead a project, sometimes you're part of a project's team that somebody else is leading. Eventually, if a few of us, and I was lucky to do that, become division chiefs or managers, and so all of these are different roles and require different, they're all complementary, but they're different skill sets. So for example, one of the things that I discovered in the transition from, the World Bank to being division chief, and the World Bank, I managed some people, who reported directly to me, but they're usually in terms of a project, so a consultant, and that project I led, and I took to fruition the loan or the study or a technical grant. Here, I was not directly doing that. I was instead kind of thinking about the strategy, and I had people who were, you know, similar in age to me, some older, some younger, but all kind of like they're doing the work that I had just been doing like a week before at the World Bank. They were the team leaders, they were the team players. And so, how do you delegate and how do you provide, let's say, autonomy with support? And so, I talk a lot about those skills and what does it take to be a good supervisor. I have a chapter about that supervisors attract great talent, and toxic supervisors can really be a big push out for talent. And so I tell all these things with anecdotes, because one of the things that's good about getting older is that you have a lot of experiences. You've experienced a toxic supervisor, and you've experienced some great supervisors, and you've had the opportunity to try and be a supervisor. Which one do you choose to be? So I I've concluded, and I don't quite say it that way, but people who tend to be really nasty as supervisors had nasty supervisors themselves. And I think they get up and they say, well, I suffered, you need to suffer too. Whereas people who had good role models end up being great, supervisors. And I feel like I benefited, frankly, most of my life, from my early times at RTI to my most of my time at the World Bank and later at the IDB, of having the kind of supervisor, not perfect, but all of them were supervisors who gave me a lot of autonomy, but also were there to give me support and guidance when I needed it or when they thought I needed it. Sometimes I didn't choose it, but I got it. And I'm grateful for that, because sometimes you don't know you need it. You think you're doing everything great, but it's great when you have a supervisor who very kindly points you in the right direction. So I use this analogy, and I use these terms of how I want people to be as professionals. You want to be rigorous, but you also want to be kind. And as a professor, that's what I try to do. It's the ed school, different from like the business school or even the Kennedy School. We really try to build a supportive environment. We believe fundamentally in that everybody can learn, and that everybody who's there should be supported. And so we want to provide an inclusive environment for our students. At the same time, we want students to learn the skills they need. And sometimes, as one of my students my first year told me, sometimes you're too nice. You can tell me I'm wrong. So that rigor with kindness is what we want to strike, that right balance where we have a safe enough environment at work, or in my case now at Harvard, where you can point people to where they need to grow without making them feel inadequate or excluded, or that it's not a possibility.
Emiliana, on this note on mentorship and the importance figure that advisors have on graduate school programs, there is one question coming in from the chat about different graduate school programs you are familiar with, especially around people that work uh, in education internationally. So people are asking for recommendation about specific graduate school programs. We also have two more questions. We have a question, and this is a very interesting one. If you were given the opportunity to start your career from scratch, would you do anything differently? Why? What? And finally, we have a question around education and environmental sustainability. So if you could say something related to your experience internationally and particularly in Latin America as well, that would be appreciated by your audience.
All right, thank you, Gustavo, for bringing those and everybody for those questions. In terms of programs, if I understand the question correctly, and please tell me if I didn't, the person's asking for programs that they can take while they're still working.
Or that could serve as good pathways to enter a career on international education.
Oh, okay. So we have a one-year master's program in the School of Education. I'm part of the faculty. We have many one-year master's programs, actually 6. But the one that I think is best suited is called Education Policy and Analysis. And a lot of our students in that program then do a concentration in global and international comparative education. And we really work hard to prepare students to be able to access those kinds of jobs. I would say the Kennedy School has a 2-year program in international public policy development, IPAID, international policy and development, I think. MPAID is what they call it, and that's 2 years, and also very focused in training people for careers in international development. I would say, in my life prior, so I'm advertising Harvard right now with this hat, but there's also people who I hired from Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy who were excellent. There's a lot of programs in the Washington area, you would imagine, because SAIS from Hopkins, also New York's Columbia SIPA has a master's degree, from which I think a lot of people who I ran into, both working or that I hired, had come from these programs. I should say Stanford as well has a good education school, and they have some good programs. I think we had a lot of, I ran into a lot of people with Stanford PhDs who came into the World Bank, less so with just masters, and I imagine it's because maybe their master's program is smaller than the ones at Harvard, is my understanding. But maybe they're in California, it's harder to connect to. So being in DC or New York or Boston makes it easier to get to where the international development organizations tend to be. So the second question was around, remind me, just say like one word and I'll remember.
Yeah, would you change anything on your professional career? What would it be?
Hindsight is 2020. So as they say, of course I would change so many things. I think the first thing I would probably, I don't know, because I think it's hard to imagine what would have been have I done things differently. But I would say one of the things I noticed in my career versus people who have achieved similar stages in career, etc., is that I was in education a lot. So I did 5 years of college because that's the normal length in Venezuela. I did 2 years of a master's, and then I did 6 years of a doctorate. And I had peers that just did like a 4-year degree in the US and then did the doctorate straight and maybe worked in between. So had I known I was going to get a PhD eventually, I would have likely, had I even had role models, like when I went to get my degree at Duke, my dad asked me like, why are you getting another degree? You're already a professional, A PhD was like only Einstein, these big, brilliant people. So I had no reference of people with a PhD. Most of my professors only had master's degrees. And I just didn't know what I was doing really. So I think with what I know now, that I think that's the major change I would do, is try to see if I could get to where I ended up a little bit more effectively. But it wasn't too bad. I mean, I was still able to get into the YP program. So I was graduating at 32. So it worked out.
We have another question coming in about emerging issues in international development, and I would love you to expand on that, perhaps related to the prior question, which was about education and environmental issues.
Yeah. You know, I think the education community has been trying for a long, for the last 5 years or so, to make the case for how education can contribute to sustainability in multiple ways. So one way is simply by virtue of, we need to educate people to protect our climate and our earth, our planet. The other one is that, education, sort of the infrastructure around education can be more green. So that now you're talking about making green schools. And so there's that, both of them I think are really important. If I'm really, really honest, I think part of the argument, there's, with the first part of this argument, one of the, and here I connected to the trends of international development in education. So I think the biggest trend of the last 5 years, along with like this push for how do we sell education as a tool to combat, for sustainability and combat climate change, is this other big push by the Gates Foundation, the World Bank, and others to focus all efforts on foundational literacy and numeracy. And they're kind of at odds with each other, because one thinks of education as more holistic and more complex than just focusing on literacy and numeracy, and the other is saying, like, look, let's at least get this right, because we have failed at so many children at getting them the basic reading skills primarily. And so I would say we are kind of in a difficult space in global education right now. I think there's also a lot of resources from philanthropy as well as governments going to areas other than education, including climate change, health, that exacerbated by the pandemic, the health part at least. And I think as an education sector, one of the big challenges that we face is that the evidence on what to do about many of the health issues is quite robust, and is easier and more, easier to implement, perhaps not less necessarily cheaper, but you invest in distributing vaccines and you prevent a lot of diseases, you invest in bed nets, and there's a lot of evidence on that. The medical field has been much more at the forefront of doing randomized controlled trials, even though, in education, we argue about the ethics of excluding children from programs, and in medicine, it's totally acceptable for excluding people from treatments that could be life-saving, and it has been for years. And so I think we still struggle from, you don't know what works, there's a lot of, and so I think that's been my, I guess, life's mission, is to convince or try to persuade people that generating evidence in education can be a tool for not just improving, but that it's not unethical, right? It's not unethical to exclude some people. You always do it somehow. You don't never have enough funding to do everything. And so if you're going to exclude people just because some are there, or some are wealthy, or some can get in line first, and others don't, and then I think that's just as unethical as randomly giving everybody an opportunity to participate and benefit. So I think we suffer from, a lack of a cohesive body saying this is where we're going, what we should do, other than, I think, the movement to foundational literacy and numeracy has gained a lot of traction, which I think is a great progress, and we have tools to measure that, and we have programs that have shown to have impact. But we have a lot less, for example, in STEM or in other fields. And then we still struggle with a lot of quintessential debates around, inequality, girls, particularly in some areas, and boys now in Latin America and the Caribbean are the big issues. And so these are things that I think we have to push the needle in both generate better evidence, but also just agree among the community around what are our priorities. We always have a really difficult time, I think, as an education sector on setting priorities. I gave a class my first year about sort of the international education infrastructure, let's say, or international development in infrastructure in education architect. And one of the things I showed was how over many years we have these, agreements, like Education for All was signed in Jomtien, Thailand, and it was access. But then when we had the Millennium Development Goals and you look at what they entail, it was a ton of things. And we go to Sustainable Development Goals and it's, I don't know, that you have a ton of, in education alone, a ton of different priorities, from literacy and numeracy to gender equality to everybody should get into the labor force and get the skills they need, to technology. I mean, it's just, and so how do we achieve it all? And I think that's where the movement of foundational literacy and numeracy has been very powerful, is say, let's focus on this. But I also think it has its limitations because, we all know that that's just a stepping stone and that you're not going to get a good job if you just can read and do basic math. So there's a lot of other things you need to get well in school, and, then there's socio-emotional, et cetera, et cetera. So I think these are the issues that we're really struggling with and continue to do that. Yeah.
Thanks for pointing out the complexity. I mean, it's definitely something the audience is very interested in. I think that there are two final questions that I think relate to the motivation to learn more about the nuances of international development, particularly in education. So one person from the audience actually asks if is there any online course type of experience coming up next after the book so that people can learn about this intricate system of institutions, donors, motivators, drivers, and so on. And there's a somehow related question, and these are the last two questions for you this evening, Emiliana. And it has to do with how these large institutions sometimes confront us with several layers of bureaucracy. And how did you manage to navigate that bureaucracy in order to keep, momentum going, in order to keep the motivation up? Those are our two final questions from the audience this evening.
So on the question about other resources about international development institutions in education, I think the book, because that's my area, even though it purports to be about international development in general, and I do say, like, if whether you want to go into education or health, most of the examples of organizations and and projects is about education. So I would say that's a starting point. I had been approached early on by one of the editorial companies to do a professional development course, like an executive education course on the book. And that's a conversation I should restart because I didn't have time last year. But I'm not sure, like, what it would entail. But I think there might be something there that we could pursue. And on the other question about sort of bureaucracy, okay, so I think what helped me was that I had spent a lot of time in school acquiring very, like, deep research and analytical skills. When you get to be a team leader or a consultant, even in the banks, there's a lot of bureaucratic work. But as a staff member, you can decide what you devote most of your time to. And I had a lot of my colleagues who loved or decided to invest a lot of time learning, for example, about procurement policies. And we have procurement specialists in the bank who you're supposed to bring aboard, and you get, like, I never attended a procurement course unless it was required. And I don't think I ever had a requirement. But many of my colleagues, education specialists, health specialists, would learn this because I think they wanted to be able to make quick decisions around some of the bottlenecks that usually happen when you're in mission and when you're seeing the projects on the ground. And honestly, I think also save a little bit of their budget resources by not bringing the procurement specialist on mission, because otherwise you have to reimburse them. And I decided early on, I don't want to do that. And I was mentored by a great, Juan Pravda from Mexico, who, one of my early missions said, this is a procurement question. I think I have an inkling, but I'm not going to take the risk because this is where, like, you can give, I don't want to say this lightly, but you can give bad advice and, maybe a technical decision is not the best. But if you don't give the right procurement decision and they violate a policy, you get in trouble, they get in trouble, it's really bad. Because that involves money. And so I decided, I don't want to spend time learning about like the ins and outs of the World Bank policies on procurement, financial management. I'd rather focus on, what are we trying to achieve? How do we know we're going to get there? How are we going to set the mechanisms? Who's going to participate, et cetera? And so that limited, in my colleagues' view, and including I know now that one of the people from the IDB who was called to give a reference when I was being recruited by Harvard, she said, "Yeah, she'll be perfect for you because she's a researcher at heart. She really didn't like the operations." And so people thought I didn't like operations because I didn't like to do all the bureaucratic processes, but I actually loved, engaging with the ministries and trying to solve their problems and figuring out how to allocate the resources either through loans or grants that they could use to improve decisions and improve quality of outcomes in the end. And so that's, to me, what, that's the combination. Some people are really, detail oriented in terms of like, are you following the processes? And we need those. And so these are what we call operations analysts, procurement specialists. We have all sorts of supports as an education sector person in the banks to help you with all the bureaucratic processes. I think people choose to invest in them because I think in some ways internally it gives you some power. But I didn't want power internally for internal power's sake. I wanted to have the ability to have impact in education, and I didn't want it necessarily to do other things. And so that's, I think, how I did it. And I realized now in hindsight, after meeting a lot of people who have known me through the years, either as consultants or as peers, that I was kind of a rarity, that I didn't necessarily want to, do my whole, career in one institution and be pensionado, get my pension from the World Bank. I would have been much smarter financially, but not as fun.
Emiliana, we want to thank you so much for this talk. Time flew today. I'm sure that we'll find some time to pass along a few of the questions from the audience that we did not get time to discuss today, but it was amazing to have the opportunity to learn from your experience and part of the trajectory and the experiences that you highlight in your book and in your more recent roles as a part of the faculty in Harvard Graduate School of Education. So thank you for much. Thank you so much for being this evening with us. And to everybody here in the webinar, we thank you too for your participation. We encourage you to stay in touch with Harvard Alumni for Education activities in the Latin American and the Caribbean region. Eric just posted the link so that you can sign up and stay tuned for the upcoming events of our network here in the region. So thank you so much to everybody and have a lovely evening. Take care.
Thank
See you
you.
soon.
Thank you so much.
Bye.